I'm going to continue with part 2 of The War Magician out of this book written by David Fisher. Now before we start off, we got this magician named Jasper Maskelyne, and he wanted to be able to use his magical abilities during World War II, but the British military couldn't see him doing anything but performing magic tricks for the troops to entertain, but he wanted to have a more active part. So in order to do that, he had to show where the skills of a magician could be used to confound the enemy. And so he ended up, they did give him a commission in the British Army, and he went to training at Farnham Castle. There he actually was able to show to him how effective the principles of magic could be used in warfare by actually camouflaging a machine gun bunker to where the inspector couldn't find where they were. They were the only ones that the inspector could not pick out because they did such a good job camouflaging it. So then he took the boat over to North Africa, and his first assignment, rather than camouflaging something, because he was part of the camouflage crew, he had to actually go one-on-one with another magician. And this magician didn't use magic tricks to entertain. He used them to control people, to show that he had special powers and had the authority to rule over the people of the land. And these were the dervish people. He was an imam. So they had kind of a magician show out. Imam would do a magic trick, and then Jasper would do one, back and forth it would go. And eventually the imam thought he got one up on Jasper by putting a sword to his chest, but then Jasper figured out what happened, that it was a trick, and exposed this fraud as for what he was, for doing a magic trick. And therefore he conceded and allowed the British troops the option to pass through dervish lands in case the Germans were to advance and they needed to make a retreat. So that was his very first real assignment as the war magician. Now, the next assignment, and as I mentioned in part 1, he did something quite amazing. He actually caused the entire harbor, in fact it was Alexandria harbor, to change places, to actually move from one place to another. But before we get to that, there's a few other smaller things that he had to accomplish before he could get to that point. So we're going to read about that right now. Where did that come from? Now, I had read earlier in the book that Jasper could actually make a butterfly appear. That's one of the tricks that he did for the imam, was he took a handkerchief and he turned it into a butterfly. So that must be left over from that. Well, one of the first things Jasper had to do was, of course, he had to create his magic band, that they called it. He had to get a bunch of other soldiers together to help create the illusions he needed in order to confound the German military. So I'm going to start reading here. Let's see. Maskelyne was hoping to attract men who had not allowed army standardization to squeeze initiative and creativity out of their minds. Respect for discipline, therefore, was not among the prerequisites. The people he wanted would not have to know how to march or salute, as long as they had ideas and were willing to work. On the appointed day, 72 of the army's motliest soldiers showed up to volunteer. Some came out of curiosity, but many more came out of necessity. They simply did not fit where they were currently assigned. Among these men were a motion picture daredevil motion picture daredevil, a perfumer, an optician, a test cricketer, a comic book illustrator, 2 politicians, and a sergeant who claimed to have the ability to read minds. Knox politely dismissed the sergeant, saying, "Then I won't have to explain why we can't use you." Because, of course, he reads minds. He already knew that. One corporal thought he was in line for the red latrine. So, yeah, this is what we're dealing with here. Of course, after all the applicants came in and been interviewed by Jasper, the first person that he recruited was Private Mitchell, or Michael, not Mitchell, Michael. A Private Michael Hill, a street-smart infantryman who had described his civilian occupation as doing anything that needed being done, what someone was willing to pay for. Hill was 20 years old and handsome in a roughneck way. He was about 5 feet 7 inches tall and compact, as if a load of steel nails had been stuffed into a sack and sculptured into manly proportions. His features were sharp, but managed to complement each other, and his greenish-blue eyes were nicely set off by sandy-colored hair, much longer than regulation length. A little description of what this guy looks like. But the important aspect that Jasper saw is he was willing to get the job done, and this person would be very vital in the magic gang's ability to create what they need to create in order to help win the war in North Africa. Little Starbucks there. All right, so he talks a little bit more about this young man. This is an important aspect of Hill. What's his name? Private Michael Hill. Hill certainly appeared to be a lad who would not be stopped by rules or regulations. Okay, the next person that Jasper recruited was a 28-year-old carpenter named Theodore Albert, and they call him Nails. Graham was serving as a wrench hand at a tank repair depot when he heard the, I can't even read that, it said Sybes, S-Y-B, or rumor about Maskelyne's unit. He hurried right over to Abbasia. Graham hated working on the iron coffins, protesting, "I'm a maker, not a fixer." Like Jasper, Graham was the third generation to work for his family trade and was extremely proud of his craft. The third generation, see, Jasper is like the third generation magician performing. His great-grandfather was John Neville Maskelyne, who created the famous illusion that Harry Houdini had performed, and even modern magicians to this day still perform it. It's called metamorphosis, or a substitution trunk, where the magician gets handcuffed, just locked into a box. His assistant stands on top of the box, and then a curtain is momentarily covered by the curtain. When the curtain drops, they instantly change places, and the magician is standing on top of the box while the assistant is locked inside the box. This was created by Jasper's great-grandfather, John Neville, famously performed by Harry Houdini, and even to this day there have been other magicians who have performed it on television. People like Doug Henning, and I'm not sure if David Copperfield performed this one, but certainly Doug Henning did. And then a couple who's famous for it, in terms of being the fastest at it, are the Pendragons. If you ever read about the Pendragons, they're known for doing this illusion as well. So the Nails, this Theodore Albert Graham, is a third generation carpenter. He's extremely proud of his craft. Working with wood is just as much an art as painting or stained glass, he explained. I work with my hands and mind, same as they do. Only difference is that the things I make, you can actually use. M&M's. That describes him being a burly man, about 5 feet 10 inches tall. A little taller than me. I'm 5'5", with flat, plain features and a short, no-nonsense haircut. Although his shoulders looked broad enough to carry much of Webble's army, it was his hands that most impressed Maskelyne. They were huge and calloused, but oddly enough, tapered into long, slender fingers, unexpectedly delicate fingers. His were the hands of a working man and the fingers of a craftsman. Knox thought he looked, appropriately enough, like a reliable tool. So far, he's got his first two men here. Another person he recruited, the guy named William Robson. He's basically a pacifist in the army. Pacifist artist whose cartoons had often appeared in the humor magazine Punch before the war. Maskelyne knew the 29-year-old artist's work and was attracted by his ability to quickly turn rough sketches into clear renderings. Bill Robinson, same as William or Bill, was tall, over 6 feet, and so very thin that when he walked, the various parts of his body seemed to be operating independently and only vaguely moving in the same direction. Added to that was the fact that his eyesight was very poor, and although he wore corrective lenses thick as porthole glass, he still walked with his head craned forward as if he were trying to spot objects in front of him before crashing into them. Of course, then the Knox. Now Knox, I don't remember who Knox is, but Knox is one of the other soldiers there working with Maskelyne. He wanted to know how he could be a pacifist in the army, and then he explained, "I don't want to hurt anybody, but I want to be a German subject even less." That was the only time his beliefs were questioned. Kind of a compromise there. The only foreign artist in the original group was Lance Corporal Philip Townsend, a painter who worked mostly in oils in civilian life. "I know all there is to know about color," he said confidently. "I know pigment. I know mixing. I know hard work." He wanted to transfer into the unit. He told them, because my major's a top flight ass. Or he doesn't like the guy that's working. That he's working under that major. All he knows is scrub floors and kill Germans. You want to kill a Nazi with a mop? Here's the broke bloke to see. Can't make much more of him, so you take me in here and leave me alone to do my work, and we'll get along just fine, and I'll do a bang-up job for you. Now this guy here, this Lance Corporal Philip, the painter, right off the bat, he's going to be quite valuable. I'm going to have to use his skills coming up. So now that he has his crew together, he's still having an issue with actually getting them to go to work and to do something, since the army is still a bit skeptical as to what can be accomplished with Maskelyne and his magic gang. The camouflage section. While Maskelyne was at Great Pillars pleading for an assignment for the camouflage section, and his men were bantering the day away, one of the most bizarre events of the war took place. Rudolf Hess, deputy leader of the Nazi Party, and
second in the line of succession to Hitler, took off from Augsburg Aerodrome in Germany and flew a specially equipped Mercer 110 across the North Sea to Petersfield near Glasgow, Scotland, purporting to try to arrange a peace treaty between England and Germany. Captured after parachuting safely from his failing plane, he claimed that his name was Alfred Horn, but soon admitted his true identity. At first, Churchill refused to believe that the pilot was actually the Nazi Party's deputy leader, telling aides as he walked to a motion picture screening room, "Even if it is Hess, I'm going to watch the Marx Brothers. Have a laugh." Even after the Reichsfuhrer's identity had been confirmed, the Prime Minister did not seriously consider his peace proposal. Hess was interned as a prisoner of war. Hitler's response to this strange episode was to order the Gestapo to arrest most of Germany's astrologers and occultists and prohibit all forms of fortune-telling. In the days following the announcement of the Hess' capture, everyone in Egypt tried to guess the motive for his actions. Hitler's response clearly indicated that the flight had some basis in astrology, which caused people to wonder about the relationship between the Nazis and the occult. Maskelyne was suddenly barraged with questions as officers easily made the giant leap from stage magic to the supernatural and assumed he was an expert on both subjects. Jasper was well versed in the occult and the supernatural, as both his grandfather and his father had spent fortunes debunking myths, but he knew very little of the importance of mysticism to the Nazis. In reality, no one did. So the Adolf Hitler was definitely very superstitious, but he also didn't believe in although little known about Hitler's astrologers, the existence of the group is not surprising. Belief in magic and the supernatural has long been part of German history. In the 16th century, the 300 autonomous states of the Holy Roman Empire tortured and burned more than 100,000 people for the practice of witchcraft. But the one thing that Hitler didn't believe in, even though he believed in, of course, it's questionable whether he really believed in it or he used it as a way to control the people. Like I said, it says right here, Adolf Hitler took full advantage of the willingness of the German people to believe in the supernatural when creating the National Socialist movement, the Nazi Party symbol. The swastika had been used by many civilizations as everything from a good luck charm to a fertility sign. The red, white, and black party colors were those of the priestly vestments of the occult-based Manichaean Manichaean religion. The SS worn by the party's elite soldiers was styled from the mythical runic alphabet. Nazi concentration officers wore the devil's skull and crossbone insignia. So one thing he didn't believe in was like stage magic, using what Maskelyne is doing for the war efforts. But soon, Jasper and his magic gang would get their first assignment here. There's a bit of a problem. They had to send over some tanks. That got diverted over to North Africa. So on May 11th, the camouflage experimental section received its first assignment. 10 days earlier, a convoy had delivered 238 new Tiger tanks to Alexandria Harbor. Behold, the Bible-quoting Churchill had signaled Warvel, "Now is the day of salvation." Looking over the tanks, the general doubted that many had been damaged in transit, and all of them lacked sand filters, without which their engines would burn out after a few days of operation in the desert. In addition, like most of the equipment arriving in Egypt, the tanks had been coated with forest green camouflage. They would stand out against the monochromatic desert like a bonfire in a blackout. They were originally supposed to go to Greece. Major Geoffrey Barkus explained, as he outlined the problems to Maskelyne and Knox, but were sent here instead when the government fell. Unfortunately, there isn't a pint of desert camouflage paint in North Africa. So now the Magic Gang has to magically produce paint that would camouflage these tanks from the enemy in desert sand. So how much do they have to make? How much of a batch? Knox asked cautiously. Barkus hesitated, then replied in a voice much too soft for his bulk, 10,000 gallons. So manufacturing 10,000 gallons of sand-colored camouflage paint, tough enough to withstand the extreme temperature fluctuation peculiar to the desert, proved to be a challenging problem. As a painter, as I mentioned, he's crucial to this effort right here. Painter Philip Townsend carefully explained making paint was not in itself difficult. All that was needed was a substrate or base to hold fast the color and a pigment to provide it. Almost anything that hardens can be used as a base, he told the group. What we really need to find is a liquid or powder that is soluble to whatever pigment we use and is capable of withstanding intense heat and bitter cold. Then we'll need some coloring substance too, some pigment, of course. Now, luckily for them, they discovered a dump where a bunch of military hardware and things had been dumped off. And it was Townsend himself, the painter, that discovered the dump. A chap in his old outfit suggested that it was the one place in Cairo where anything might be found. Like everyone else serving in the Nile Basin, the painter had been vaguely aware of its existence, but until he hitched a ride there and saw it for himself, he never appreciated it. In fact, this dump would be crucial in much of what other work from here on in. And some of the things that they found. Among the mounds of scrap, it was indeed possible to find almost anything. The dump was that place where anything that belonged nowhere truly belonged. Entire waterlogged cargoes salvaged from sunken ships could be found in this dump, and bulks of vehicles even Warvell's desperate mechanics couldn't restore, and metal piping of all lengths and circumference, and wooden deck timbers, corrugated tin sheets, smashed typewriters, and broken desks. But one thing they did find, though, while rooting through the cargo raised from a torpedo freighter, they chanced upon rows of sealed tin drums. The drums were opened, and one of them watched cautiously as a thick brown substance oozed out. Ew. He dabbed a bit on his finger and tasted it. It had a bitter but familiar taste, and it took him a moment to properly identify it. Now, who's the him? This was this was Townsend. This was our painter friend Townsend. Worcestershire sauce. Thick Worcestershire sauce. Rows and rows and rows of tin drums filled with slightly rancid Worcestershire sauce. Hundreds of gallons of Worcestershire sauce. It tasted awful. It was wonderful. He knew he had the paint base. Additional searching turned up tons of spoiled flour, another load of cement. Enough of everything was carried back to Abbasia to allow Townsend to experiment until he was able to work out the proper mix of cement, flour, and sauce. Mix would serve as the paint substrate. Unfortunately, it was mud red in color, making it as useless in the desert as the original forest green. A pigment was needed to turn the paste a proper sand color. 2 days had already gone by. They're on a time scale here. But to their surprise, the pigment for the camouflage paint had been right under their noses. Under their feet, too. After spending a week testing with every coloring substance he could think of, the frustrated Townsend was ready to quit. But as he walked down a dirty path with Jasper, discussing the problem, he stepped into a pile of the answer. "Camel chips," he said, reaching down and picking up one of the dried, hard, sandy, brown pats. Of course, camel droppings. Sun-dried camel dung was a perfect color. It even turned different shades of desert colors depending on the length of time it was exposed to the sun. It was cheap and plentiful. After a few attempts, Townsend figured out how to make it soluble in Worcestershire sauce paste. Testing proved that it held fast in heat and cold. Camel dung made a perfect, albeit malodorous, desert camouflage paint pigment. Might even add smelly too. Thus, the Dung Patrol was born. The Dung Patrol. "We stand behind every camel," Maskelyne joked, but in fact it was almost true. One of his men, or an Egyptian worker recruited for the harvest, trailed every caravan leaving the city. Nearby oases were cleaned daily. The streets were swept each dawn for night leftovers. Private Hill grumbled through his duties, complaining that a man of my ability should be reduced to this. Graham fashioned a little metal scooper for each man. Professor Knox explained that animal feces had been used thoroughly throughout history for everything from constructing shelters to currency. That's called smelly money. "If I never see another bloody camel again, I'll be too bloody soon. It'll be too bloody soon," Hill grumbled. Late one afternoon, as the men relaxed at the station. I have to say that again. You can say it in the British accent. "If I'll never see another bloody camel again." No, that sounds more like a combination British accent and Southern accent. All right, never mind. Guess that means you're breaking your date tonight, huh? What is it? Break tonight. Well, Robson said the young private social life had become the subject of 1,000 nasty jokes. No, Graham said calmly. "We don't have to make fun of Michael's ladies. I think we should let their looks speak for themselves." The carpenter was carving a small block of wood and paused and looked up. "Besides, I heard he was very good to them. Even took one of them to the dog show on Gazera the other day." So we're kind of talking about Robinson and his personal life right here. Yeah, this was kind of curious. Cairo wanted to know what possible use a tiny camouflage unit had for thousands of camel chips. The fact that the group was commanded by Maskelyne the magician increased the curiosity. There was considerable and creative speculation. When asked what his people were doing, Major Barkus simply smiled enigmatically. Jasper knew the value of active curiosity, and so he did his best to keep the truth secret. Eventually it leaked out, though, to the delight of some and the disappointment of many others who had entertained far more exotic possibilities. So that's their first real assignment as the Magic Gang. I got to make paint for tanks. So we gotta move on to chapter 4 here. Now the next assignment here, rather than producing paint from nowhere, was to turn a tank into a truck. The Prime Minister Churchill was publicly pressuring Wavell to resume his abandoned, this is on page 63, near the end, his abandoned offensive with the newly outfitted Tiger tanks. But Wavell resisted. He knew his men were not ready to fight again, and he was grimly aware that Rommel lay waiting for him in the desert like a wounded cat. So, yeah, a lot was going on right here with Rommel. Like a wounded cat. Well, Africa Corps controlled the passes onto the escarpment. No, the Africa Corps, that's the British Army. They're called Africa Corps. They're the ones in North Africa. And controlled the passes onto the escarpment. There was little chance for victory, as Maskelyne would soon be told. The outcome of Operation Battle Axe might well be determined by his ability to transform a tank into a truck. Now let's go to chapter 4. The situation facing General Wavell in mid-May was distressingly clear. His army was better supplied than Africa Corps, but the enemy was entrenched in strategically superior positions and was armed with an unknown quantity of tank-killing 88s. Western Desert Fox, or West, I can't even read. Western Desert Forces' only real chance for victory was to achieve tactical surprise, but that seemed impossible. Somehow a substantial number of Churchill's Tiger Cubs had to be deployed without being detected by German observers, since Rommel's land and air spotters had been alerted that the British might soon move again, and the barren terrain made it relatively easy to spot any movement. This could be accomplished only by making the tanks appear in place out of thin air. Out of thin air. So then, here now Jasper and his magic gang now are struggling with another issue there. How do we do this? How do we hide tanks in plain sight? So here's what this is Jasper Maskelyne speaking here. What we've got to do is somehow prevent him, and that's Rommel, from bringing up his reserves until we've been able to smash through to his supply line. Once we've broken through, he'll have no choice but to withdraw to protect his supplies. Well, no, that's not Jasper. That's not Jasper speaking. Who was that speaking? Barkus. Yeah, it's Barkus here. Barkus wanted him to do this because of the paint job he did with cow dung. Talking about Wavell being really impressed with that, and they were discussing it with him, and he's the one that said what we got to do is somehow prevent him from bringing up his reserves until we've been able to smash through to his supply line. Once we've broken through, he'll have no choice but to withdraw to protect his supplies. Do you see? Jasper nodded. It's quite simple, really. He'll jump just as soon as he's determined where our main thrust is taking place, and there's no way to hide major armored concentrations on the open desert. But if we could disguise our intentions, even for a little while, we'll gain the extra time we need. Barkus reached into his breast pocket and took out a folded sheet of notebook paper. This is pretty funny here. The general thought something like this might work, he said, handing the slip to Maskelyne. Page had been torn out of Wavell's ubiquitous field notebook. On it, the general had sketched the profile of a tank surmounted by a large flat board. A second sketch showed that an aerial view of a truck had been drawn on the board. Theoretically, at least, to an observer flying overhead would look down on this and be fooled into believing it was a common lorry. Well, of course, Maskelyne wasn't impressed with this because it's a flat board. It looks like nothing else except the flat board. In addition, unless the spotter aircraft was flying directly overhead, the observer would be able to see under the board. So now they've got the work cut out for them. And this is basically how he approached it. Jasper began just as he would if he were creating a stage illusion. He listed his objectives, the obstacles that had to be confronted, and the materials available to work with. This time, rather than making a woman appear to burst into flame and emerge as a butterfly, his objective was to design and construct a lightweight, disposable frame that would enable a tank to pass as a truck under close scrutiny. The problems were numerous. Enemy intelligence would be checking shadows and silhouettes as well as the obvious details, so the shadow cast by the cover had to precisely replicate those cast by a real truck. Its silhouette had to be perfect, and the tank's tread tracks had to be wiped out. For practical purposes, the frame had to be so simple that a few men could rapidly raise it, even working under adverse conditions, and shed it just as quickly. Sightlines had to be maintained at all times. Finally, the material from which it would be made, and he hadn't determined what this would be, had to be available in the basin in abundant quantities. So after reducing the large problems into as many small problems as possible, he attacked each one. What materials were easily obtainable? How would this truck frame open? How would it close? Would hooks or latches serve better? How many pieces should the frame break into? 2, 3, 4, even more. Should these pieces snap together or be bolted together? Should they be reusable or disposable? As he made each decision, he incorporated it into a rough sketch until the frame began to take shape. Gradually, he eased his way through the thick layers of conscious thought, and that place he called the factory of ideas, where imagination reigned and from which solutions blossomed almost mechanically. His knowledge and innate creativity combined to present an acceptable construction to him. So back in Abbasia, he outlined the situation for the gang. There's one Matilda that's short up pretty bad, but still moves well enough to suit our needs. So you need to test this out to see if it works. But the trouble is, we can't pry it loose from the repair shop. So here he has a way to disguise a tank to make it look like a truck. But now he needs a tank in order to test it on, and he can't get a tank. Even General Craig's people can't help me on this one. They can't buck Wavell's directive. As he explained the situation, he wondered about the tent stopping. It seemed casually enough right behind Michael Hill. Without that tank, we can't demonstrate that sun shield, and they call this a sun shield. He continued, laying a fatherly hand on Hill's shoulder, and if we can't demonstrate the sun shield, we'll be out of business. He gazed down at Hill and asked softly, does anyone have any idea how we might get hold of that tank for a few days? Sergeant Fuller raised his hand. May I suggest, sir, that we file the proper emergency requisition forms from the Depot Transportation Company, sir. Yeah, right. Do it the military way. Knox caught Fuller's attention and held an index finger vertically against his puckered lips. I guess like this. Hill gently lifted Jasper's hand off his shoulder. Oh, no, you don't, the private protested. A jeep I could see, even a small lorry, but a tank is another kettle of fish entirely. You know what they do to a fellow that lifts a tank? He shook his head. No, thank you, Aunt Mabel. No, indeedy. So let's find out what happens. How did they get their tank? Where's it at here?
Let's just say they stole the tank. Had to be sneaky about it.
I believe it was private. Who was it? Who was it that took the tank here? Now there was a. Let's just start right here. So at 12:30 the following night, a military police jeep pulled up in front of the dimly lit tank repair annex. This shop had been converted from a wagon garage for the emergency and contained only two damaged Matildas. Those are 2 tanks. A bored corporal, his rifle slung on his shoulder, casually paraded back and forth in front of the open garage door. A private hopped out of the back of the jeep, his helmet pulled down over his eyes and the left side of the pencil-drawn mustache drooping slightly. The corporal did not pay too much attention to the mustache at the time, although he would recall it later under questioning. Relief, the private announced. The corporal did not recognize him. You're new? Private Hill nodded. Yeah, okay, this is Private Hill, the painter. This morning from Crete. I figured they'd give me a few days. They figured different. Haven't even had time to get unpacked. How was it over there? Pretty bad, huh? So there's kind of a little chit-chat right here. So kind of chit-chatting away. So then after a bit more discussions and talking, the corporal climbed in the back of the jeep next to Graham, and Robson drove him away. As soon as the guard was out of sight, the righteous Fuller, frightened and complaining about this incredible breach of military procedure, is one that wanted to go through paperwork to try to get it, backed the tank lightly up to the garage door, and the gang went to work. They ended up converting the tank in right there in the garage. 10 minutes passed before the exhausted guard opened his eyes and realized that the jeep was heading in the wrong direction. He leaned forward and tapped Robson on the shoulder. I say, he said, "You're going in the wrong direction." Bill turned around enough for the guard to see he was wearing sunglasses. "Right," he said agreeably, and continued driving. Graham laid a friendly paw on the guard's shoulder and pulled him back. By the time a squad of military policemen located the camouflage experimental section 2 days later, the only vehicle in the area was an ordinary 10-ton truck parked in the distance. I wonder what that is. Maskelyne flatly denied any knowledge of the heist. "A tank, huh?" he said in amazement. "That's out of my league. I can produce a rabbit for you if you like, or a canary in a cage, but not a tank. That's a bit much even for me." This one of them?" the MP asked the shaken repair shop guard, indicating Maskelyne. The corporal shook his head. "Chap I saw was much shorter and sort of funny looking." We're going to jump down here to the end here. We're talking about the Sun Shield. This is a Sun Shield prototype, the one sitting out there in plain view that was a truck that they had to borrow from the motor pool. It weighed only 30. The Sun Shield only weighed 30 pounds. That's the covering over it. Tests using the borrowed Matilda proved that it could be rapidly snapped into place by 2 men and be discarded just as quickly by releasing the hand hatch. Now here's what it looks like right here. They actually have a picture of it. This is where it's open, the Sun Shield here. When the Sun Shield's open, on top, right here. And then this is actually what they look like. This is what it looks like as a truck. And then there's another view of it that looks just like a truck right there. That's actually a tank. I know it looks like a truck. And see if we get back to where I was and missed my place. Alright, so you finally get this camouflage tank finally gets its debut here. And then we're going to read right here. This is on page 74. Inside the tank, Frank Knox, he was inside the tank, was sweating profusely. At Jasper's insistence and over his objections, the disguised Matilda had been slotted in the center of the front row. Now, this is a whole front row of trucks. So we have a tank in the middle of the trucks that's been camouflaged with the sun shield I just showed you. The best place to hide something is in the most obvious spot. Maskelyne had explained. The audience resists looking where they think you want them to look. Knox remained unconvinced. So the troops formed a single file a few hundred yards from the observers. The disguised tank led the parade. When they were within 150 yards of the high dune, in plain sight, the pilot suddenly shouted. There was a pilot, somebody flying around, and a pilot from the air trying to spot the tank as well. Pilot suddenly shouted through a storm of static, "Okay, I got it. I got it. The fourth one in the column. It's number 4. The officers zeroed their glasses on that truck. Maskelyne focused on it curiously. Except for a strip of torn canvas flapping loosely, the vehicle was virtually indistinguishable from the others. 2 colonels immediately agreed with the pilot. The test of the observers, including General Craig, disagreed. The general glanced at Maskelyne. Jasper shook his head. "Well then," grumbled the 7th Armored Major, "where the bloody hell is it?" They couldn't find it. The trucks roared closer. When the Matilda reached the 75-yard marker, Knox pushed open the heavy commander's hatch a few inches and grasped the sun-shield latch. He turned it as if opening a door. "Here goes," he shouted, but couldn't even hear himself over the engine. As the officers scurried the column, the lead truck suddenly split precisely in half as if it had been sliced down its center by a mammoth butcher knife. The 2 sides collapsed lazily onto the desert like some surrealistic monster emerging from a wood and canvas cocoon. Matilda charged forward, its thin, deadly snout aimed directly at the dune. So they proved themselves here now that they can actually hide a truck. Now they were able to prove themselves by being able to create paint to hide the tanks in the desert from nothing, practically having to find it wherever they could, and turning a tank into a truck. They finally got the attention of the British Army here. So now they have another problem here, a very big problem that they're going to have to deal with. That is protecting Alexandria Harbor. Now here's Barker talking right here. This is on page 85. He says, "Here, Alexandria Harbor." He jabbed his finger deep into the sand. Now he has a big sand model right here of the whole campaign area. And so Barker's sticking his finger in the model in the sand. They knew how desperately we need to keep it open. They've been bombing it pretty regularly, bombing Alexandria, that is, with the entire campaign in the balance. Who knows what they'll drop on us? Air defense is moving as many ACAC guns as can be spared up there, and the RAF will provide whatever additional cover they can, but we've got to give it our best effort. You want us to try to camouflage it? Barkers looked at him grimly. "I want your people to hide that place so well that even Farrukh in a bloody rowboat couldn't find it. Try to make it disappear so they can't bomb it." So So concealing an area this large and this active from the Luftwaffe seemed like an impossible task, even given the fact that the enemy bombers had thus far restricted their attacks to nighttime. After a tour of the harbor, the gang set up operations in a... I can't even pronounce that. Q-U... I barely even read the letters here. Quonset? Hut, or in some kind of a hut. They spent the day trading fanciful concepts. But after contemplating what can they do with this impossible situation to protect Alexandria Harbor from being bombed by the Germans, Jasper finally comes around and says, "All right, I have got it." "Well," Knox said huffishly, "it's about time." The men gathered around the table. To begin with, Maskelyne said, "The harbor is simply too big for us to do anything with it. We can't cover it up, we can't disguise it, and we can't hide it. There's only one solution left to us, isn't there?" What is that? No one responded. "We've got to move it." Move it. Move it, move it, move it, move it. Oh. Hill smacked his forehead with his palm. "Of course," he quipped. "Now, why didn't I think of that?" Jasper expertly squeezed every drop of curiosity out of the gang while they waited for him to explain his incredible solution. He parted the large pockets of his uniform jersey in search of a match, and when he failed to find one, simply snapped his fingers into flame and lit his pipe. Knox had noticed that Maskelyne played his small tricks only when feeling quite confident. Once the pipe was lit, he settled back into his chair, crossed his legs comfortably, and began his explanation. "Around the turn of the century, my grandfather introduced an extremely effective levitation at the Egyptian theater. In a burst of smoke, he'd appear to fly off the stage right up to the crystal chandelier, where he'd perch and answer questions from the audience." He paused to savor the aromatic tobacco. "Can anyone guess how that was done?" "Fairy dust," Robson ventured. Frank Knox had been doing some reading on magic. Transposition? Substitution? Under the smoke cover, a wire frame dummy was sprung from a trapdoor and traveled up a very thin guide wire to the chandelier. Questions were answered through a rudimentary speaker system. Because the dummy was dressed in exactly the same suit as my grandfather and rose from the same place he was standing, the audience believed it was him. I think we can adapt that principle to this situation. Now this was Maskelyne thought of this as kind of his big grand show for the Germans. And of course, he's producing this show for the pilots flying overhead. They're going to be the audience, while of course the harbor is going to be his stage. As producer of this show, Maskelyne was involved in all aspects. He seemed to pop up everywhere, supervising, solving problems, redesigning props, pushing slow workers. "It's not much different than staging a full production at the Royale," he said to Knox as they drove back to the real harbor one morning. Now the harbor they're going to use, I think it's again Alexandria Harbor. There's another harbor nearby that's going to fool the Germans into thinking, the German bombers into thinking that that's Alexandria Harbor. And the name of that harbor was Marriott Bay. Just simply a desolate area surrounding Marriott Bay was sealed off, and construction of the decoy harbor began. Using night reconnaissance photographs as their blueprints, the engineers replicated the ground light pattern of Alexandria Harbor by staking hundreds of electric lanterns into the sand and mud, then wiring them as if solving an elaborate connect-the-dots puzzle. Plywood sheds of varying sizes and shapes were raised under Carpenter Graham's direction, some of them packed with explosive charges that would emit flash and smoke similar to that of German aerial bombs when detonated. So they're working really hard on making I can pronounce it, Mariette Bay look like Alexandria Harbor. And Jasper, being the producer of this show, is involved in every area, make sure everything's perfect as it should be. So all the lights and detonators were connected to a master control console that Maskelyne and Knox would operate from atop Pharos Lighthouse. The Pharos Lighthouse was in Alexandria Harbor. They actually built a duplicate lighthouse in Mariette Bay. Well, the decoy layout was in fact much smaller than the actual harbor. Great care had been taken to maintain the same size ratios between identifiable landmarks as existed at Alex. Just Alexandria for short. Just Alex for short. As long as their ratios were consistent, it would be almost impossible for enemy pilots to notice the size difference. So here are building really hard to create an alternate harbor. They're causing Alexandria Harbor to move one place to another. This is his metamorphosis trick on a large, grand scale. Now here's the final test of this. I get to test it out. It's on page 80 or 92. There, Jasper is taking a deep breath, ready to test it out. Takes a deep breath to calm his nerves and push down a long steel handle. He's actually control everything. As if a huge black blanket had suddenly been swirled over Alexandria Harbor, it disappeared into the night. A few isolated lights twinkled aboard ships laying at anchor, but most of these were quickly extinguished for this blackout drill. Well, that's all right, isn't it? Knox said with great relief. The city like Alexandria sparkled gaily in the distance, but the harbor had ceased to exist. Lights, Jasper commanded. Frank worked his console. A few seconds later, just as if the entire harbor had been picked up intact and deposited a mile down the coast, the lights of the Mariette Bay decoy burst into sight. Jasper critically examined the display. "What do you think?" he asked. Knox paused. It looked far more realistic than he had believed possible. "An engraved invitation," he replied, obviously impressed. Townsend reported that the aerial view of the dummy was excellent. Satisfied with the results, they shut down their equipment and hurried down the lighthouse stairs to safety before the arrival of the Luftwaffe bomb delivery service. That's what they called them. Without the anti-aircraft guns and searchlights in place, the decoy would not be used at this time. The bombers did not come that night, as they were hoping at one point. By 10, so the bombers didn't come that night, but they were a bit worried since the bombers didn't show up. Could the Germans have learned that some sort of trick awaited them? If they had, maybe they think they've finished the job, Frank suggested, that they climbed down the long wooden staircase, but so you keep going here. So they started again. Maybe they took their places again at twilight on the 24th. But this time, just as Lael Anderson began her mournful love song, The enemy bomber flight was spotted by a rat patrol on the desert. The planes were behind schedule and approaching on a slightly altered course, but they were coming. The report was relayed to Maskelyne to the lighthouse tower. "They're on their way," he told Frank, and his body tingled with the excitement of an opening night. He slammed down the power lever. The harbor went dark almost instantly. "Lights!" he shouted into the wireless. Robinson Decoy Lighthouse came ablaze. Seconds later, the rest of the dummy harbor twinkled into life. 5 anti-aircraft searchlights began sweeping the sky. Maskelyne and Knox waited in the darkness, barely breathing. A light breeze whipped up some whitecaps, but the real harbor was otherwise invisible. At that moment, Jasper couldn't help thinking about the lifetime of illusions that had gone wrong. He remembered the assistant who fell asleep inside the apparatus, the locks that jammed, strings that broke, the night he had appeared on Huey Green's radio show, Magic on the Air, when the box in which he had been locked failed to open and was forced to bang and scream for help while the Green covered for him by singing made-up verses of Fiddle My Diddle. His reverie was broken by the murderous drone of the enemy bombers. They came in a little lower than usual, sighting on the cloud-dim stars. They flew directly toward the real harbor, ignoring completely the brightly lit dummy. As soon as they were in sight, Maskelyne and Knox began shutting down the lights at Marriott Bay, just as if Alexandria Harbor were blacking out for the raid. But the bombers remained on a true course toward Alex.
Uh-oh. Is this going to be a failure for them?
Let's find out. In the cockpit of the Point bomber, the flight leader was confused. The rapidly dying lights of Alexandria Harbor beckoned to him, but according to his instruments, they were not precisely where they were supposed to be. If he was to believe his compass, the entire harbor had been moved. Jasper held his breath as the enemy bombers remained on course to the real harbor. "They're confused," he shouted to Knox, more hopefully than certain. Then under his breath he pleaded, "Come on, you bloody sots. Come on, take it, take it." "The Ack J," Frank yelled. "Get 'em shooting. Bass, now." Jasper screamed into his radio, Now, go ahead." Almost immediately, the anti-aircraft batteries surrounding Marriott Bay began pounding away. Still, the bombers remained on course. On the ground at the decoy, Mike Hill was out of his slit trench, waving his cap at the bombers. "Over here, you dummies," he was screaming. "We're over here." First salvo of anti-aircraft fire further confused the flight leader, and seconds later a British fighter group was spotted coming in for a scrap. He had no more than time to make a decision. Choosing to believe his eyes and ears rather than his instruments, he grabbed hold of his control yoke and made a hard turn to starboard. "He's taking it," Frank said hesitantly. Then louder and with certainty, "By gum, he's taking it." The rest of the enemy flight gracefully followed the leader into the turn. As they did, the RAF squadron jumped them. Instantly, machine gun tracers began scratching the night. The bomber pilots bravely maintained their tight formation to the target, their gunners swatting to the pesky fighters. Suddenly, Junkers rose out of formation and peeled off, its engine smoking, made for the safety of the Mediterranean. The other planes quickly filled the hole it left. They began dropping their loads even before they were directly over the harbor. As the first bombs blasted deep, harmless craters into the sand, Maskelyne and Knox took over. "Now, Frank," Jasper screamed. "Now!" The professor slammed down his lever so hard He shook off his glasses. For a long second, absolutely nothing happened. Then a series of staccato blasts jolted Mariette Bay. Flames clawed into the air. Secondary explosions thundered above the battle roar. "Hey presto!" Jasper shouted as he gleefully played his console, but he was drawn out by the noise. The second wave of junkers and what are those? Savoyas? Sighted on the flames. Hundreds of real bombs peppered Maskelyne's sandy stage. Another enemy plane was hit, and this one twirled fatally into the bay. Townsend's damaged crews went to work as soon as the flight harbor leader turned right. They raced through the narrow alleys at Alexandria Harbor, pulling tarps off their rubble, spreading paper-mache wreckage, scarring buildings with painted drop cloths, uncovering canvas craters. At Mariette Bay, bonfires ignited by Graham explosives charges and fed by a pyre? P-Y-R-E, pyre of dry timber, made an enticing target for the succeeding waves of bombers. The raid lasted exactly 33 minutes. The dummy armor was nearly obliterated. Almost all of the lamps were shattered. Many of the sheds were completely destroyed, and those left standing were damaged. One of Hill's battleships fell apart, but the remainder of his fleet survived the attack. Robinson's lighthouse escaped unscathed. The moment the last wave fled into the desert, the engineers' repair crews went to work. By morning, the fires had been extinguished and sand had been thrown over the charred wreckage, and crews were at work replacing the destroyed scenery. Jerry would be returning that night. They're called Jerry's. Those are the Jerry's were the Germans that were bombing the harbor, and the harbor had to be ready for the next performance. So they had to do it again. Had to fool the Germans again. Townsend's crew had set up the stage for Alex by dawn. Enemy reconnaissance planes arrived over the real harbor as expected and took high-altitude photographs. So they had to make the real harbor look like it was bombed, even though it wasn't, with fake rubble and everything else. During this inspection, camouflage nets covered the decoy at Mariette, just in case an enemy observer glanced down the beach and noticed unusual activity. The gang piled into their Quonset hut at Alex in mid-morning, exhausted but exuberant. They began reliving the night in loud voices, but Jasper shut them up. "So far, we've done all right, but in the next few hours, their photo experts are going to be examining the pictures they took this morning. If they're not perfect, the verdict would be delivered that night. A repeat attack on the decoy would prove that the deception was successful. But if German intelligence detected a single false shadow in Townsend's damage display, they would be selecting their target much more carefully." The gang tried to sleep during the day. The bombers were late that night, bursting out of a thin cloud cover just after Lord Haw, the there's a $1 million word there. The supercilious traitor had finished twitting Western Desert Fox about Operation Battle Axe, that silly affront to the genius of Rommel. Jerry didn't hesitate this time. The planes pounced on the decoy. They came in lower than usual at dangerously slow speeds to increase their accuracy and plastered the beach with tons of high explosives. It was the most ferocious attack yet. Jasper and Frank added to the pyrotechnics by blowing off Graham's packages. By the time the bombers climbed back into the sheltering clouds, Mariette Bay was a flaming wasteland pocked with massive craters. Ribbons of oily smoke swirled thousands of feet into the sky and blackened out the moon and the stars. Seen from the cockpit of a bomber thousands of feet into the air, it looked very much like hell. 2 Savoyas went down, It took all night to, I guess those are a type of German airplane. It took all night and most of the following day to replace the damage. The attackers came 8 successive nights. The engineers slaved through the days, turning out brand new damage. To Hill's chagrin, his final destroyer was sunk in the 8th raid. That proved to be the last attack. Unexpectedly, the enemy seemed to lose interest in Alexandria Harbor. For the next week, Jasper and the gang scanned the night skies, but the bombers never returned. British intelligence did not know it at the time, but as the rumors had predicted, Hitler had ordered Luftwaffe groups transferred from the desert to Europe and the Russian fronts. Alexandria Harbor was saved. Although Italian submarines would make a desperate attack a few months later and enemy sabotage would continue through the war, this was the last massive effort to shut it down. Rommel had lost the Battle of Supply that week in June 1941. Eventually, millions of tons of supplies would be safely landed at Alexandria Harbor, enough to overwhelm the Desert Fox and his Africa Corps. The success of Maskelyne's transposition concept at Alexandria Harbor proved that such decoy installations could be used on a far greater scale than ever imagined. The principles of light, shadow, and dummy structures perfected by the Magic Gang would be used around the world to protect strategically important targets. Using these techniques, entire dummy army and Navy bases as well as airfields were constructed in most battle theaters. The Merritt Bay illusion firmly established Jasper Maskelyne and his Magic Gang as an important and quite unique military entity. No one could figure precisely where the unit belonged in the table of organization. They were more than camoufleurs, but less than engineers. They had nothing to do with supply or transportation and knew little about combat, but no longer did anyone question the value of a magician at a war. Instead, brass hats whispered top secrets about the deeds of Maskelyne and his queer little group, and took comfort that someone had finally outwitted the fox. By the way, I was wrong. Africa Corps is the Desert Fox. That's Rommel's crew. That's not the British guys.
So finally, Maskelyne, Jasper Maskelyne, and his Magic Gang gained the respect that they deserved from the British military. So next time, I'm going to begin with chapter 6. Jasper does his even greater illusion, causing the 60-mile-long Suez Canal to disappear.